Why don't we go and get started? My name is Keith Choi. I'm with the Johns Hopkins Education and Research Center for Occupational Safety and Health, known as the Johns Hopkins ERC. And we're very pleased to offer this free webinar series that meets every month with Maria Fusco, the Chief Conservator, and Margaret Wing Dodge Chair in Conservation for the George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum. So without further ado, I'll let Maria introduce our speakers.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. We're always pleased at the interest in the program, and even more pleased in our guests today who are going to present. I think this will be a fantastic session. I try to give a little background just in case this is the first session in the series that any attendees are joining. And in essence, it started this series based on some work we were doing at our museum, and we're encountering some issues, many other people have before and concurrently have encountered as well. And kind of we were looking at getting beyond the testing phase into sort of implementing a response phase. Sort of, we have all this data, what do we do with it to keep ourselves safer? And then other people are, of course, encountering these same questions and these same concerns. So I wanted to gather together people who are kind of trying to move the needle beyond that and get people resources in order to learn how to test, which is going to be a big focus of today's presentation. You're going to learn a lot of helpful information and just how to implement that afterwards as well, or at least begin that process. So our three speakers today are very respected and very active in the community, and we're really lucky that they gave us their time today. Brandy Howard is a certified industrial hygienist, amongst other very impressive certifications, and is the Building Environmental Sciences and Industrial Hygiene Practice Lead for Terracon's Rocky Mountain Division. Right now, she's also Vice Chair for the AIHA Museum and Cultural Heritage Industry Working Group, and I would very much encourage anyone to join. And then she partnered with Paulette on the Museum Poisons Test Kit project, which is a fantastic resource. They're going to talk a little bit on that today. Paulette Reading is a textile conservator in private practice, and she's been in the Denver, Colorado area for 18 years. Her clients are varied museums, historic houses, private collectors, and she's been really, she was on the AIC Health and Safety Committee as well, and she's been really pushing the needle forward as well on collaborations and getting sort of private practice conservators the opportunities that they offer, getting them more harnessed and more spotlights on them. So they've both been fantastic advocates in our field. Mark Nelson is head of collections management and registration at History Colorado in Denver, and he's been there the past 6 years. Prior to Colorado, he worked in collections management positions in the DC area as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our three speakers. A little more ado. If you have any questions, please just feel free to add them to the chat, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. Where we get to pose questions to the panelists, and we'll just kind of go from there. So turning things over now to Brandy, Paulette, and Mark.
Okay, I'm gonna try and share my slides now. Oops. Second. Okay, am I good?
Looks good.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, hello, thank you, Maria and Keith, and thanks to the Textile Museum, the George Washington University Museum, and the Johns Hopkins ERC for creating this program and for giving us the opportunity to talk about our projects. So we wanted to start by introducing again, but thank you, Maria, for the introduction, and also briefly talk about how we all came to work on this issue of hazards in collections. I'm Paulette Reading. I've been a textile conservator in private practice in Denver, Colorado for 18 years. I did serve on the AIC Health and Safety Network from 2019 until this year, and now I'm also a member of the AIHA Museum and Cultural Heritage Working Group. My interest in health and safety issues started for personal reasons. I developed contact dermatitis while working on certain projects, particularly powdery textiles. And I developed increasing sensitivities to all kinds of chemicals, adhesives, soaps, personal products, etc. These skin sensitivities interfered with my ability to do my job, but also in my life in general. And I can't prove that my work has caused or exacerbated these problems, but I'm pretty sure that it has. And if you talk to most conservators, um, particularly those of us who are a few decades into our careers, many report health issues that they suspect have been made worse by their jobs, or at least know somebody who has. This is a separate but related topic that I think warrants its own research. But without the science to back it up, I personally feel pretty strongly that my symptoms could have been mitigated significantly had I taken proper protective measures earlier in my career. It's been very disturbing to discover that items that I've conserved years ago were contaminated with arsenic and other hazardous chemicals. And it's upsetting to think about treatments that were likely contaminated with lead and other toxic substances that I completed while I was pregnant or when my kids were very young. I didn't know to change my clothes or even remember to wash my hands before literally picking them up from daycare. My kids are now in college, but I continue to meet people who work with these collections and who are still unaware of potential hazards, despite all of the work that's been done since the mid 2000s and research. I don't want another generation to have the same upsetting realizations and regrets that I do about this, and I feel strongly that we need to change the way that we're sharing information to make this issue common knowledge, and to give people the tools and resources to address the issue and make decisions about handling possibly contaminated items safely. Brandy?
Hi, I'm Brandy Howard. I work with Terracon as the environmental department manager for our Northern Colorado team here, based out of Greeley, Longmont, and Fort Collins. I'm a professional environmental engineer, a certified industrial hygienist, and a certified safety specialist. So I have a wide range of experiences in all aspects of the environmental health and safety field. Early in my career, about half of my work came as a contractor to the National Park Service, where I performed hazardous materials assessments in historic structures throughout the American West and Midwest. In that role, in one of my jobs, I was asked to perform some radon testing for a building that had a fossil storage center. It was like a visitor center with a back fossil storage room. And as part of that, we got much higher results than I was expecting to see. The West, we generally have high radon results, but this fossil room was exceptional for the building and for the area. And I came to find out as part of this process that the fossils they were storing were gathered from a rock layer that uranium is present in, the uranium ore. So they just are naturally a lot more radioactive than a lot of other materials, I don't know, that I was expecting they might have in their collections. So I wound up helping them design a mitigation system, and it led to all kinds of interesting conversations about collections related hazards that I just wasn't aware of until that point. In 2019, the AIHA Museums and Cultural Heritage Industry Working Group had a call for volunteers, and I reached out, mostly from my experience working on some of these collection sites at the Park Service. And that's where I met Kathy Makos, who recruited me to join the team. Now I am the chair of the Museum Working Group. And so if you have any questions about volunteering with our group, I'm happy to answer those. My contact information will be on the last slide. Feel free to reach out. At this point, I'll turn it over to Mark to introduce himself.
Thanks, Brandy. So I'm Mark Nelson. I'm the head of collections management and registration at History Colorado. History Colorado is the state's historical society. We have a relatively large museum with in the city of Denver with an array of collections. We've got about 400,000 objects, over 1 million photographs, and more than 15,000 linear feet of archival material. My interest personally in this topic of sort of hazardous museum collections really started after having a rather unsettling experience early in my career, where I learned that that a collection of horse tack that was on display in some historic outbuildings had been treated with pesticides, many years earlier, but I had been actively dusting and cleaning them regularly for well over a year before learning that. And that's kind of what, that's where my interest started, but then professionally where I really started sort of engaging with this topic was really not until after participating in the testing project that you'll be hearing about shortly.
Okay, great. Thanks, you guys. So today we're going to start I wanted to start briefly by talking about some hazards found in textile collections. And then we're going to give a summary of the research projects we've been referring to that involve indirect testing for contaminants. We'll look at a few case studies and talk about potential applications for indirect testing. And then we'll describe our current project that provides instructions for people with no previous training to obtain and submit samples for analysis. And then finally, Mark's going to talk about his experience and subsequent outcomes at History Colorado since having participated in our first study in 2022. So because I'm a textile conservator, I wanted to take a moment to discuss some of the hazards found particularly in historic textile collections. I think these objects present more hazards than a lot of people realize. When describing contaminations, we often distinguish hazards in collections as either applied, such as pesticide treatments or accumulated soiling, or inherent, meaning the toxins are part of the object's manufacture. Textile collections commonly contain both. This is a slide I like to include in my Care of Textile Collections talks. Insects are one of the biggest issues when caring for textile collections, as most of us know, I think. An infestation can destroy an object if a problem goes unchecked. And we now recommend safer measures to prevent damage, such as implementing integrated pest management programs or an IPM. But it's not surprising that textiles have a long history of toxic pesticide treatments. Application of pesticides was the recommended practice for controlling infestations in both institutional and private collections from the late 19th century and well into the 20th century. And in addition to the long list of pesticides historically applied to cultural collections, as discussed in this series and elsewhere, such as arsenic and other toxic metal compounds, organic pesticides such as DDT, textiles were routinely stored with and continue to be stored with mothballs. While not as toxic as some of these other hazard health effects, they smell bad and they're ubiquitous in textile collections. And it doesn't feel accurate to me to talk about hazards in textile collections without giving them a mention. Because so many of the textiles and cultural collections were at some point utilitarian objects, such as clothing that was worn, bedding or linens that were used, or home decor like upholstery or tapestries, they can be more susceptible, I think, to acquired contaminations. Before they became collections, they were often not protected in controlled environments. They were exposed more to the elements. Most of the objects that I treat in my studio date from the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, both from museums and private collections. And most of the items that I receive for treatment are very dirty. So the soiling may have resulted from use because of poor storage environments or both. Exposure to incidents like natural disasters such as fire and flood bring the risk of toxic smoke, mold, and other issues. I currently have an item in my studio that is contaminated with cyanide from toxic smoke from a wildfire. These are details from a flag dating from 1877 that was covered in a dark sooty soiling that is actually pretty typical to textiles that I receive for treatment. So I started testing the dust that's left on my table from these objects using over-the-counter lead test strips. I don't use the test strips on the objects directly. I just use them on the dust that's left on my work table or other surface. And most of the time, I find that this dust tests positive for the presence of lead. I would say easily more than half the time. These slides that I'm showing are of the sponge cleaning to demonstrate the level of surface soiling on the object. I don't have a slide of the lead test strip in action, but just know that I would use the test strips on the table after I move the flag aside. And then a quick mention about some of the toxic materials used to make the textiles themselves. Historic dyes, mordants, and weighted silks all potentially contain toxic metals such as arsenic, mercury, chromium, and lead. These textiles, in part because of their manufacture, are frequently in very poor condition now. And this slide shows a montage of details showing characteristic shattered silk that will be familiar to most textile conservators. Because of their current condition, this poor condition, these items now are basically toxic dust. Garments, tapestries, flags, samplers, embroideries in this condition are found not just in museum collections, but historic houses, living history museums, private collections, family heirlooms, antique shops, and even on eBay. I believe registrars, volunteers, collectors, family members, and other caretakers of these items should all know about these potential hazards. I don't think these things should be discarded, but with awareness and resources, people can preserve and care for these collections and protect themselves from harmful exposure. So in 2022, I partnered with Brandy and another industrial hygienist for the project we were calling Museum Poisons Test Kit. It was funded through a grant provided by the School Mountain and Plains Education and Research Center, and I just want to give a special shout out and thank you to our local ERC for funding this initial project. The goal of our project was to spread awareness about possible contaminations of cultural property and to provide low-cost access to analytical testing for potential hazards. Our hypothesis, as stated in the grant, was that the presence of toxic metal contaminants can be detected by testing museum dust adjacent to the objects with samples obtained by personnel with no training. So these are the museums that participated in our study. They're all mid-sized to larger museums with professional museum staff, large collections, and active exhibit schedules. None of these institutions, however, have in-house conservation departments. They lack access to analytical testing, and like almost all cultural institutions, they have limited time and resources to address issues like hazardous collections that aren't part of their everyday responsibilities. It was important for us from the very beginning to involve these stakeholders in the research. As a conservator working in private practice, I think I bring a different perspective to this issue than conservators working in institutions. It's these museums, those without conservation departments, also smaller museums, historic houses, private collectors, individuals who are trying to reach with this information and resources. I think larger institutions doing research frame this as outreach, but for conservators in private practice, it's actually just our job. These museums and clients are, they're our clients, they're our colleagues, and our peers. So I think we bring a better understanding of the needs of these populations and also understand the obstacles that they face addressing the problem of hazardous collections, including access to analysis. The term participatory research is somewhat new to me, but I think this is the approach that we've been taking with our studies, and I'd like to learn more from those of you in public health about this concept. So there were multiple steps to the planning and preparation for the study, but basically what we did was take wipe samples of dust near objects suspected of contamination. Taking these wipe samples is a common technique used in the field of industrial hygiene for museum dust that Brandy could talk about more. We collected samples from a variety of surfaces, such as exhibit fabrics, solid platforms, and other storage materials. We also took samples from a variety of locations, including both storage and exhibit spaces. Samples were obtained by both the industrial hygienist and museum staff members, so we could compare results. We then submitted the samples to an independent lab for analysis by atomic absorption spectroscopy, inductively coupled plasma, mass spectrometry, or AAS, ICP-MS, and we tested for the presence of arsenic, lead, chromium, and mercury. One area we tested was under this object, which is a purse made out of an armadillo that's in the collection of the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. It was stored on a shelf underneath a spinning wheel. It was a crowded warehouse storage. A significant amount of dirt and dust was visible on the wipes. And from these images, I hope to illustrate like the procedure for taking the wipe samples. You could see that we're using a template to measure the area being tested. This process is described in detail in the leaflets that we've compiled so that people can have access to analysis on their own, and we'll talk more about these leaflets in a bit. Samples from there tested positive for arsenic, chromium, and lead. Now we can't know for certain if those contaminants originated from that object, from the purse. Regardless, the contamination was there in the storage area. Among other suggestions, we recommended staff wear masks and gloves when we also recommended that the staff purchase over-the-counter lead test strips to test for the presence of lead throughout the warehouse, as it might be that the dust itself in the space was contaminated. And I know this slide might be hard to read, but I wanted to share what the results from the lab look like. Learning to read these results can take some getting used to, and when obtaining samples for analysis independently, people will likely need to consult an OEH professional to help with the interpretation. We'll happily share more details about this study, including the testing procedure, how we chose the test locations, why we used ICP-MS, more about the results or more details about the results, or any other questions you have if you reach out to us directly. But overall, the results of the study showed that obtaining wipe samples from surfaces adjacent to potentially contaminated objects proved to be an effective method for a first step detection. We hope to gather more data to refine the testing procedures and to make this analysis accessible to the public. I also wanted to talk about this test location, as Mark will be referring to it later. This building is a reconstructed trading post at one of History Colorado's community museums. The trading post is used as an interactive space. It does not contain accessioned objects, but historic props and other educational materials. We took samples from underneath the historic furs in the rack of the trading post room and from the floor of a separate room. And we found evidence of arsenic, chromium, and lead from both locations. This was of particular concern since, unlike accessioned objects, which have restricted handling protocols, these objects were handled by the public, including children. This is not uncommon. Many cultural institutions, including living history museums and visitor centers, offer hands-on activities with historic specimens. And Mark is going to speak about the museum's response to this finding and other input about their participation in the study in a moment. So during the first study, we noticed that in some cases we could not effectively obtain wipe samples from the storage materials. Acid-free tissue, for example, is not a good material from which to use wipe samples. The wipes themselves are damp and the tissue just tears apart and would turn to mush with that technique. And the left shows a box of historic dresses. That's, typical type of storage where you have tissue interleaving in between dresses that may possibly have, arsenic dye or other contaminants. And the right shows a textile rolled storage where the textile is tied directly with twill tape. So oftentimes items are secured directly with cotton twill tape, and obtaining wipe samples from long lengths of twill tape is impractical for testing. So we knew at the end of that study that we wanted to test the viability of bulk sample analysis. That involves taking samples of the storage materials themselves and submitting those to the lab for analysis. The School for Advanced Research, Indian Arts Research Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, agreed to participate in a study by collecting, this is our second study, by collecting and submitting storage material analysis. I managed to get some funding for it by applying for a professional development grant from FAIC, which is the Foundation for the Advancement for Conservation. The $1,000 grant covered the cost of the analysis. Because of the small scope of the study, we limited the analysis to just testing for arsenic. And since the main goal of the study was to determine if testing the storage materials would be a viable way to detect the presence of arsenic, we selected items that were either confirmed or highly suspected to have been treated with arsenic. So basically, we were testing from known positive locations. The Indian Arts Research Center, or IARC, is a division of the School of Advanced Research. It is a research collection and not a museum. The collection is focused on Southwestern Native American objects and consists of over 12,000 items of pottery, basketry, paintings, jewelry, and textiles. At the IARC, the collection is utilized by community members, artists, or researchers. Because of the accessibility of the collection, it is particularly important to them to know about what collections might have been contaminated with toxic pesticides. So compared to most institutions, the IARC has actually done, I think, quite a lot of research investigating pesticide history. As far back as 2003, at the time, a conservation intern from the Museum of New Mexico completed a report titled A Survey of Historical Pesticide Use at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the Museum of International Folk Art, a manual for museum staff. The institution also had various XRF testing done over the years that was contracted out, which confirmed that some of the suspected cyberized pencil notes meant that the items were treated with an arsenic compound. They also contracted with an industrial hygienist in 2000, way back in 2009, to evaluate the levels of arsenic surface contamination in areas where chemically treated items were handled. And then it was determined that the current housekeeping and handling procedures in place were adequate and appropriate. I think this is sort of similar to some of the exposure studies and testing that Maria described that they did at the Textile Museum. And more recently, in April 2024, the Metropolitan Museum of Art Scientific Research Partnership partnered with SAR IARC, and they conducted staff training on the use of a portable XRF, and they also did additional testing for some of their textiles. And it was the information from that recent analysis that we used to select our known positive locations to test the storage materials from the textiles. And now I will turn it over to Brandy to describe the project.
All right, well, since the end goal of this study is for staff or the public to obtain and submit samples for analysis independently, museum personnel collected the samples and received no in-person instruction. Throughout this study, we communicated solely by email and online meetings, like the one seen here. This is a slide of me, Paulette, working with Catherine Cooper, the research scientist at the National Park Service National Center for Preservation, Technology, and Training, who worked with us on this project, along with Laura Iliff-Cruz, head of collections, and Alexis Lucero, assistant collections manager at the IARC. Paulette and I, along with Catherine, consulted with the laboratory while they were carrying out the analysis, created a detailed instruction leaflet describing the protocol for the sample acquisition and analysis, which we can share later. Next slide. These are some of the views of their storage areas. The textiles that were sampled are mostly housed in closed cabinets or in rural textile storage. For our study, we sampled 5 different materials: cotton twill tape, cotton muslin, acid-free tissue, soft Tyvek, and cotton stockinette that were in contact with the objects. Again, we are happy to share more details about the planning and methodology if people reach out to us independently. Before collecting samples, the museum gathered as much information as possible about the items that would be tested. This is a spreadsheet they created for the study, and I know it's incredibly hard to read. In the interest of time, I'm not going to review all the information that they put into this spreadsheet, but they basically recorded some details about the object, its pesticide history, and what they estimated, or they put the weight in of the object and then the result of the object. So everything all wound up in one final spreadsheet. The point of sharing this slide, though, is to demonstrate that when you're obtaining samples for analysis, the more information that you can compile about your test site and the objects, the more meaningful your results will be. Prior to sampling, they undertook a few steps I thought were helpful. They gathered their PPE and supplies, including lab coats, dust masks, and nitrile gloves. They had a garbage can available for switching out their gloves in between samples, and they had polyethylene sheeting that they spread out on their workspace as a prep area. They used tissue paper or small pieces of plastic that were set up on the scale ahead of time, and in between objects they would change those so they weren't cross-contaminating anything as they were weighing things out. They had, it's also very encouraged to have all those labels typed up with your sample numbers on them ahead of time before you start this process. These steps and other instructions are all outlined in detail in the instructional pamphlet. These are just some examples of photos of them cutting and measuring the materials that they sampled. After the materials were cut, they carefully folded outside in so that the surface that was touching the object was on the inside of the fold, and they placed them into the pre-labeled containers. Everything was then loaded into padded envelopes and prepared with a chain of custody and shipped off to the laboratory for analysis. This slide came from Laura of the IARC, and it summarizes in her words her experiences in self-collecting these bulk samples. Basically, she thought the process was straightforward. It offered an additional avenue outside of XRF testing for those simple results. Can be more affordable if you don't have the budget for renting XRFs. In this case, for just arsenic analysis, it was $65 a sample versus tens of thousands of dollars for buying an XRF, or hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars for renting an XRF. And the testing would give you that presence or non-presence of arsenic or other materials if you decide to analyze them for different metals or different chemicals. With no previous documentation, this could aid you in careful handling and processing, right? So you get the results and you can make a decision as to whether or not you need those handling procedures. Cons that she specifically mentioned is that, you know, when we're sampling mounts or we're sampling Tyveks or we're sampling the cloth or the interweaving tissues, all those things had to be replaced because they get destroyed in the analysis process. So that causes more time needed for staff and resources. And she definitely needed some support when it came to filling out the chain of custody and understanding the different laboratory, you know, language. So we did try to address that with a third pamphlet that we'll talk about in a bit, that talks about working with your analytical laboratory. So all the results from this study came back positive for the presence of arsenic. This is not surprising since we did select items that were previously confirmed or highly suspected of having been treated with arsenic through their history and previous XRF testing results. These results indicate that submitting samples of housing and storage materials for analysis by an outside lab can provide a useful method of detecting certain contaminants in cultural collections. Each method does have its own advantages and disadvantages. Many factors may influence these results. We suspected that the more porous materials like twill tape and tissue may serve as a reservoir that will hold on to the arsenic better than some of the smoother materials like Tyvek. The results do appear consistent with that idea. However, this is a very small sample size, and that limits our ability to interpret all the variables that could influence these results. Additional data will help refine the procedure and make the analysis more user-friendly for the general public. So when we're looking at results, such as the one that came back from our bulk sample analysis, interpretation is critical. These results do not quantify risks to people interacting with the objects. These tests did have quantitative results, but that's because what we tested though was that surrogate material. What we're finding is the amount of arsenic that was in the twill tape, right? That doesn't necessarily relate to the amount of arsenic that was in the object itself. Toxicity and assessment of risk will require asking additional questions. For example, which contaminants or pesticides were identified? We found arsenic, which is a persistent metal. It's not going to fade, and depending on exposure or dose can cause serious health effects. How representative was the potential volume of the contaminant in the sample that we analyzed? In our case, it's not representative of the arsenic in the object. It just shows how much arsenic has been transferred onto some of the storage materials. How is that object going to be used? Who are the individuals that will be interacting with the object? Do they have underlying health concerns? Will their exposure be acute or long-term? Industrial hygienists and medical toxicologists can help with the interpretation of these results and assessing the risks. So our project involves testing debris that have been shed off an object or storage materials that were in direct contact with possibly contaminated items. We're not testing the items themselves. So indirect testing can be a more accessible method of detecting hazards in the collection. These techniques used in this study are not intended to replace other forms of testing or analysis. Direct testing of the potentially contaminated objects using XRF or microchemical testing would bring more reliable results as to the source of the contamination. Indirect testing using wipe samples or bulk sample analysis offers a simple one-step detection for the presence of hazardous chemicals. Since we are testing materials adjacent to an object, we cannot be certain that the contamination originates from the object. It could be the result of cross-contamination or other environmental factors, such as the presence of lead paint on your shelf or in the building. False negative results are also a possibility. If you utilize these techniques, you should recognize this is just a screening tool for the presence of a specific contaminant, and it doesn't necessarily provide a definitive result. Determining the level of risk is a complicated calculation that includes multiple factors not considered in this first step analysis. Testing of housing materials or dust adjacent to an object does not indicate the amount of contamination present on the object. The intended use of the object also significantly influences the level of risk posed to the user. It is also important to consider that certain populations may be more susceptible to illness from exposure. The response to a positive finding also involves a nuanced assessment because every situation presents specific considerations that require individual evaluation. This analysis should be considered a preliminary tool to begin to address the problem of hazards in a collection. So all that being said, I think Paulette and I have given this talk a lot, and we always talk about the limitations, but we've never really had a slide in here about the advantages before. So I think we thought they were self-evident, but we're going to state them out loud this time. The huge advantages I see personally as an industrial hygienist who's not trained in conservation and doesn't really know how to handle objects correctly is that this testing allows me to look for contamination without impacting the object itself. So I can look at the dust on a shelf underneath an object and I can sample that and see whether there's contamination there without handling the object. It is reasonably affordable compared to some of the other options that are out there. And I think the pamphlets make it accessible. So we're trying to take the complicated language, tone it down, figure out how to make it, simple so that you can wipe the surface, put them in the container and send them to the lab and get results. It can be done with limited training. And it's useful to indicate that contamination or presence of pesticides. So if it's on an object and it's shedding into the environment, I think that's very good information to know. And you can use that after the fact to assess whether your updated cleaning protocols are working and effective. We believe that making testing more available will help spread awareness about the hazards in cultural collections. Rather than oversimplifying a complicated issue, and increased awareness presents the opportunity to spread knowledge about potential hazards and to share resources about how to address the problem. With more knowledge and awareness, people can be better equipped to take potential next steps. Responses may include labeling and establishing protocols for handling contaminated collections, adding additional testing of objects to confirm the results, consultations with medical toxicologists or industrial hygienists about exposures, and training on the proper use of PPE. And I'm going to turn it back over to Paulette.
Okay, thanks, Brandy. I want to talk about some situations where people could. Oh, now I'm having an echo. Are you guys hearing me okay? Okay. Where people could benefit from having access to indirect testing for contaminants. As we know, returning items that have been contaminated by pesticides poses a serious problem. Independent testing of storage materials can provide another tool in the complicated process of repatriating collections. Testing of storage material or nearby dust should still require obtaining consent prior to analysis. Nevertheless, since direct handling of an item isn't required, it could offer a less invasive approach. Individuals or tribal communities having already received returned items that may contain pesticides that they don't know about could submit samples independently without having to call in an expert. Additional consultation might be needed to interpret results or help with risk assessment, as we've talked about, but it could provide a good place to start. And finally, this analysis could also help in the complicated process of completing a review of historical pesticide treatments in an institution. Items purchased or donated at the same time or from a single collector may have been treated en masse, If storage materials from 1 or 2 items test positive for the presence of arsenic, for example, the museum can flag associated items as potentially contaminated. A lot of times these items will have similar accession numbers because they all came in as part of one collection. And that could save costs without having to test everything. Again, testing of storage materials does not provide definitive findings, but it could provide more information at a low cost to aid in this complicated process. And if an item at an institution is requested for loan, exhibit, or research, testing of storage materials can help to inform any protocol to protect personnel while handling the objects or other, display recommendations. Without testing, you can assume contamination. I mean, this is something that comes up and proceed as if it were toxic. But in order to do that, you still need to know that the risk might be there in the first place. And also, in practice, it can be more difficult to convince people to take precautions without having some kind of actual result. We've been focusing again on objects that have been treated with pesticides, but as we discussed earlier, this is not the only way objects can be toxic. Like I mentioned with historic textiles and weighted silks and things. Some of you might be familiar with the University of Delaware Winter's Poison Book Project that addresses the issue of contaminated books in libraries and archives. In very preliminary conversations with them, they've indicated that the testing of storage materials and wipe sample analysis could benefit their efforts as well. And it's also really important to know if an object has been treated with pesticides before carrying out conservation treatment. As a conservator in private practice, I've often requested that an item be tested prior to treatment for my own health and safety and to inform treatment steps. Protective measures can include completing the treatment with additional ventilation or wearing proper PPE, or sometimes I may decide not to treat the object at all if it's contaminated. But carrying out conservation treatments not only involves really delicate handling of an object and could, you can't always wear gloves. Most of the museums that I contract with don't have conservation departments, so they don't have testing or the money to pay for analysis. And this is also true with private clients. So this is a way that maybe we can, test to see if something's contaminated before that. And then finally, we think this type of analysis could be a useful tool in completing collection surveys, particularly collections containing, textiles or natural history objects, and possibly as part of a CAP survey, if CAP surveys are or ever will still happen again. But in order to make this widely available, we'll still need to refine the testing protocol. And while the studies we've completed so far have brought promising results, we do need more data. So now Brandy's going to talk about where we're at right now.
All right. So the goal of our research is to increase awareness about the hazards in cultural collections through available testing methods commonly used in the field of occupational and environmental health and safety. People with no specialized training can obtain and submit samples for outside analysis. People may likely need help in interpreting those results and devising the next step actions, but our hope is that independent access to analysis will provide a first step towards addressing the problem. All right, so we have a few pamphlets which include instructions on how to identify, obtain, and submit samples for analysis. The 3 of them that are listed here: collecting bulk samples for analysis, wipe samples for analysis, and a third one that's more about working with your laboratory. The sample collection pamphlets include step-by-step procedures for collecting either wipe or bulk samples of storage material for analysis. So far in our studies, we have been biasing our sample locations to items or surfaces in contact with items that have been known to be contaminated, and then submitted them for metals analysis, either just arsenic or arsenic, chromium, lead, and mercury, etc. We believe that there is a potential to use these sampling techniques for other analytes as we've been using them just for metals. Organic pesticides and other analytes can require different solutions than the simple pre-moistened ghost wipes that we've been using in our studies. I know some organic pesticides dissolve better in other solvents besides water, for example. Use of these pamphlets in consultation with your analytical laboratory can provide guidance on ways that you could approach testing your collections or collection areas for a variety of different analytes. That third pamphlet, as I mentioned, is just a brief overview on choosing and communicating with an analytical laboratory. These two labs photographed here, ALS and Eurofins, are the labs that we used for our studies. There are lots of other analytical labs out there who may be familiar with testing for pesticides, such as in the environment. Not all labs are the same. They're going to be familiar with the science, but they're likely not going to have any experience with cultural heritage implications. So bring your questions directly to them. There could be a learning curve in the communication, but it's important to have these conversations. We're looking forward to the feedback too on these pamphlets as well. And then Paulette, I think we should just skip the chain of custody slides and go right on into Mark's talk.
All right, thank you. Give me one sec to pull up my notes here. So yeah, what I would like to talk about now really are some of the impacts that I've experienced, personally, but also at my organization as a result of participating in the testing project that Brandy and Paulette have discussed. And these impacts have been sort of in the short term, immediate impacts after testing, and then sort of things that have continued to have impacts for, to today, years after having participated in the project to begin with. So I'll start with the immediate. And I think a little background is helpful kind of to set the stage. So History Colorado is, as I've mentioned, it's the State Historical Society for Colorado, and we have a flagship museum in Denver. But the organization also has 6 additional community museums across the state. So our community museums are comprised of much smaller museums. Some are like historic buildings that are managed by History Colorado, but the day-to-day operations are really run independently for the most part. And many of them are, 3 to 6 hour drive away from Denver. So they're not close. So just with that in mind, after we got the test results back, we had a really strong response at one of our community museums when they learned the test results. And I think what really drove this was an overall lack of awareness from staff that really caused a lot greater fear when they learned the results. So most of History Colorado's community museums don't have staff with educational backgrounds in collections management or related fields. And so the concept that collections could be hazardous in any way really came as a big shock. People were really scared and they were upset after learning the results. In particular, one community museum where this recreated trading fort that Paulette mentioned had these furs and skins on display. So it became clear that, more work, more conversations needed to be had as a result of the test results. And so myself and some other staff from the History Colorado Center in Denver, we made a trip down to this community museum to meet with folks to help them understand better, the testing, the results, what the results meant, and importantly, really just to kind of listen to their concerns that they had. Out of that meeting, it was a productive meeting, but ultimately what they decided that they really felt was necessary was to involve the local health department. And so that's what they did. They brought in their local health department to kind of help reaffirm kind of what the results meant for folks and what it meant for them personally and their health and safety, and to help give further guidance on how to respond to the results. The health department did confirm that the presence of pesticides on the items that had been tested. Fortunately, they reaffirmed that those results were relatively low and that they were not a significant concern, and that the items could even be kept as long as there were, particular steps put in place to make sure that the public couldn't interact with them, and that they were just, displayed in a much safer way and were no longer, they weren't being handled, for example. But really that one site and with the work that we did, that one site, the results there led to a broader concerns and a broader review of educational materials at all of our community museums. In all of our sites, really. And so it was decided that specifically there was going to be a focus to review the education materials such as hides and skins, things like buffalo robes, deer skins that might be on display or being used in educational programs essentially across the state. That was the primary concern because they were things that could be, be handled. And so that's where the focus really was. It was challenging. We had to come up with some guidance though to help folks understand what was likely safe and what wasn't. And ultimately, nothing is perfect. We can't say with, certainty, anything after this date or made by this company is okay, that sort of thing. So what we did is we decided that the guidance would be that any materials that were purchased in the last 5 to 10 years from reputable sources, those were deemed low risk and likely okay to keep, but that everything else, out of abundance of caution, that we should remove them and replace them with, items that we had good information on, essentially. And so that's ultimately what did happen across all the sites. A number of pieces were removed and they were disposed of or just taken out of circulation altogether. But also, this experience at the community museums really emphasized the need for there to be better sharing of resources. As I mentioned, that folks at the community museums tend not to have the expertise or the background in collections management or have a lot of knowledge in these topics. So there really needed to be better communication. And so one of the things simple things we did was just to help share resources such as the National Park Service's conservagram on hazardous materials, so that folks had a better understanding of, what are some of the common collections that you might, see or come in contact with that might be hazardous and why, to help with increase awareness. And then really, I think a big thing was just providing direct communication to staff like myself and other collections management staff, so that if concerns did come up, if staff did come in contact with things they had concerns about, they could reach out directly. They could call us on our cell phone and we could have that conversation immediately. Paulette, you can go to the next slide. So that really covers, in the first weeks and months of our work, or the impacts of that testing, kind of what happened immediately. But I also want to talk about some of the things, organizationally, and some things that I've done in the years since to really to make changes at our organization. And fortunately, as a result of participating in the project, that really led to a much more buy-in and support from upper levels of management in this, with a focus on hazardous materials, and that work, there was work left to be done that we should focus on and prioritize. One of the things I've started doing is to do department-wide training on this topic. So we have a pretty standard checklist for onboarding that covers really mundane things like, getting to familiar with the Gmail suite and reviewing policies and procedures, meeting with staff. But now on that list is an important step that they are required to now meet with myself in the first 2 days of their onboarding, so that I can have a conversation with them, engage what their understanding is of hazardous collections, and what are some of the common collections that we have, things that they can do to keep themselves safe, and really just a basic 101 on the topic. And the goal is really to educate people at the start of their employment, and not wait for an issue to arise down the road. Another really simple thing that we've invested in are these craft paper rolls that you can see in one of the pictures. The paper's really cheap. Folks can pull out a sheet of any size, lay it on work tables, and dispose of it afterwards. And this is really encouraged, not just for objects that are known hazards, but anything that could be hazardous. And really, I encourage it just in general, right? As Paula was talking about, a lot of things are just dirty, and there can even be lead in that. So the goal is to prevent cross-contamination and to provide an easy and cheap way that people can keep themselves safe and keep their colleagues safe at the same time. We've also found other uses for this craft paper in being able to store contaminated storage supplies. So you can see one of the photos. There's a textile tube that previously was being stored or was being used to store an ethnographic blanket that had pesticides that we know has previous pesticide treatment. And the object is currently now on display. We wanted to keep the textile tube. It's, they're not cheap. It's still good, but we also wanted to make sure that it wasn't simply put back in storage without some sort of barrier or warning not to reuse. And so the craft paper has really come in handy for that sort of thing. And then another simple step we've taken is really just to increase the quantity and access of personal protective equipment. We have always had a large quantity of nitrile gloves available, but a major change I've made is to make sure that we have a lot of N95 masks and even Tyvek suits available. And I feel that in the past, there's been a general feeling that you should only use like an N95 mask if it's really needed. But now my hope is that by having them in a lot more abundance and easy to grab, that staff are much more inclined to just grab one for quick use, and that they really don't need to be kept in reserve for, special circumstances, and that they're an everyday, tool that people can use to help keep themselves safe. And then we've also made some changes to our exhibit planning process. We've always covered known hazardous objects, but I think there's been less consideration in the past given for objects that could be hazardous and we just didn't have confirmation of. But as a result of participating in this testing project, we've really switched to now kind of working under the assumption that large categories of materials could be positive for pesticides, and just to treat them like they are. So for example, as many of us know, ethnographic collections have a large history of being treated with pesticides. So really anything that comes out of our collection from our ethnographic, holdings, we're going to make sure that they're covered, or that they're, far enough removed in an exhibit that they're, can't be encountered or pose any sort of hazards to the public. Paulette, do you mind sliding to the next slide for me? And then just a few more things that we've done. We've also done a greater focus, implemented a greater focus on identification and warnings. Some of that has been done through like physically adding labels in storage, as well as digitally in our database. So like many organizations, we label known hazardous objects, such as on the outside of storage boxes. But in reality, what we have confirmation of is really a small percentage compared to the overall collection that we have. And so I've started to really work to add these physical warnings to identify potential hazards to whole categories of materials, even when we lack that hard proof. So for example, I've done this with collections like our ethnographic textiles and things with like hats made with beaver felt. When it comes to our collections management system, which is Argus, we've made a couple of different use of a couple of different fields to educate and to communicate about known hazards or potential hazards. So one field that we make use of is called the remarks field. And that's really an open text field that we use to note whether something has had testing in the past, what those results were, as well as to just outline if it's even a potential hazard and why, and adding information about like how to protect yourself and what steps should be taken when handling that object. And with such a large collection in our museum, this is the sort of project that is very much a work in progress. Only a small percentage have these kind of warnings, but it is something that there's a lot of buy-in at my organization on, and something that I have time and resources to commit to, and hope to continue doing, so we can really have an impact through this. And then one other field we make use of is called a flag field. And there's a variety of different flags that could be added to a record. But two that we make use of that we've added are for known hazards and potential hazards. And so something I've started doing to encourage staff in my department is to make sure that that field is prominently displayed in their search results. So for example, on my interface of the database, flags are now the second field that comes up that visually for me right after the object ID. So I really treat it as core information that I need to know in a snapshot. And my hope is that by encouraging others to make it one of those fields that displays automatically in the results, that there's going to be much greater awareness and safety. And just this past year, we did a revamp of our collections emergency plan and realized this was another opportunity to incorporate concerns and to add some policies and procedures around hazardous materials in our collections and what that might mean in a collections emergency. And so, just an example, something that we added is that if we are removing wet materials and there's a known hazardous object, even if we're trying to quickly remove items and get them out of the building so we can get them dried, to make sure that that object, a known hazardous object, is being stored, in a box or by itself. It's not being added to other materials or dried with other materials, so that we can make sure that we're avoiding cross-contamination, even if there's an emergency. And and then finally, I'll mention that we've started incorporating this into educational programming that we've been doing here. So we have a virtual series called Museum Basics that we've been hosting for the past 5 years, and we host a virtual class 6 times a year. so every other month. And we have really good attendance from cultural institutions across the state of Colorado. Mostly those that attend are smaller institutions. We get a lot of volunteers, so we realized this was a great opportunity to talk about this, educate about this topic to folks that might not be getting this information elsewhere. And so Paulette and I joined up and taught one of our first classes on this just this past year that was dedicated just to talking about hazardous collections and ways that people can keep themselves safe. Thanks, Paulette.
And that's it. I know we're at an hour, so hopefully we do have time for questions for you.
Yeah, we have I think we tried to put the program out for like an hour and a half. So if anybody can stay on, we still have a pretty strong, a couple of people have dropped off, I'm sure, because they have meetings, but we still have quite a few participants here, 69. So if everyone wants to hang out a little bit, I have 3 sheets worth of questions, but you know, what
Should I
we'll
stop
do is
sharing my screen, or should I leave our, yeah, how do you want to?
um I'd say if you want to keep that up for a little bit,
Okay.
that way if people can jot down. So just so everyone knows as well, this has been recorded, and Keith with the Johns Hopkins ERC, they are posting these on their YouTube channel, so you can go back and slow down the recording and listen, get all this information again, look at each slide as well. And as well, if you guys have any follow-up questions, you can reach out to me or Keith, and here, of course, is Paulette, Brandy, and Mark's information as well. I'm curious, I've had these questions, and one of the first questions here is about the PowerPoint, if that is perhaps shareable. And our last question, this came in about the pamphlets. I was wondering, can we, and I don't want to put you guys on the spot, Paulette and Brandy, and Mark, but can I share your pamphlets, or can Keith and I share your pamphlets with everyone who registered for the program? Many people were unable to join from East Asia and Australia and whatnot, so there's a good 400 people registered, I think, for this. Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I could send you, I don't know what the best way is to do that. I could just send you the PDFs.
Yeah, I already have, I think, 3 of them.
Oh,
But
I think that's it. Yeah, so
if
I
you
did
clean,
share.
okay,
Yeah,
got it.
you have
Yeah.
it.
And I will say too, just to put it out there, I mean, I know your purpose in the pamphlets was to facilitate, um, you know, people that maybe don't, non-specialists or people without chemistry backgrounds, or if you're in a smaller institution where you don't have as much support structure. But I think they're helpful to literally everybody. We've done some testing in our museum, and I've been looking at your pamphlets for a long time and waiting for that, unicorn-like moment where I have some free time. But our intention is to try to follow some of your pamphlets as well and just test out a bunch of different methods. So I think you have a pretty universal application here. And I really very strongly applaud what you guys have done. This is a very, very helpful presentation.
Thank you. We haven't gotten any traction yet with people using the pamphlets. We'd like to. I mean, this is just sort of our unpaid side gig, obviously. But we do ask that if people are doing the testing, if they could just share with us what they did and the results, so that we could start compiling all of that. That's really kind of an important part of this, because then we can, improve the procedure, where people have questions. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Keith, do you think that's fairly doable? We can share the pamphlets, and maybe just with that, a reminder to reach out to Paulette and Brandy if they do employ
Absolutely.
them. Okay.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. I'll
Okay.
send out a follow-up email with the link to the recording and whatever attachments.
Great. One question that's come in, are you recycling the craft paper or labeling it and throwing it away as contaminated materials?
Yeah, so the craft paper is really only intended, it's for one-time use, which is why it's great that it's cheap. You just tear it off and we throw it away. Yes, we're not recycling it at all. We don't often label it. I mean, if we are working with like known hazards or working with something, for a long period of time, we'll like bag things up separately. But for the most part, it's just getting thrown away and then tied off. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah,
it's
not in a communal trash either, I should say. So it's like it's a, just in collections management, and then it goes in a bag and goes straight to the dumpster.
got it, thank you. And that paper is, I mean, it's nice and thick and not, I don't know if non-porous is the right word, but it's pretty dense and an effective barrier, I would imagine. And I had a question about that too. You're using it on like tabletops and cart tops, it sounds like.
Sorry, ask that again. The question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and the craft paper, are you using it on tabletops and sort of tops of carts?
Yeah, I mean, the intention really is like, yeah, the goal is that anytime people are working with objects, or have any concerns, like that, I really push for like it's easy, like don't worry, like it's cheap, just grab some. Like, you can make it any size you want. Like, it's better to just, yeah. We have barriers already, so but we were doing, it's kind of like a barrier on top of a barrier at this point. But rather than throwing out like sheet foam and things that we've taken time to like adhere to the table, it's a lot easier just to throw out the craft paper, whether it's on a cart or table or any.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good, I don't want to say simple idea because it's very clever, but it's a approachable idea. And, we found the same with disposing of, used tissue, things like that, that at the low levels we were finding transfer, even with gloves, it was acceptable to put those in the regular trash. We do try to isolate our gloves just, to keep certain things away from housekeeping, having to, they don't handle directly the interior of the trash anyway, but it's very good kind of nuts and bolts question, I think. Another question is, what is cyberizing?
That comes up in like did you want to answer, Brandy? You can.
You go for it.
If you look at I'm sure it gets a shout out in uh the Nancy Odegaard's books. It's kind of a brand name for pesticide treatments that seems to specifically be like arsenic compounds that was used early in the 20th century.
Oh, got it.
So sometimes in museum records, they'll have on their little catalog notes like cyberized, or you see that, and maybe other names too. But that one I've seen not just at the IARC but in other institutions too. Must have been a popular product.
Mm. As sort of a catch-all phrase or a commercial phrase, which would capture a lot of different heavy metal use, or do you think was it arsenic in particular?
Um, I just I don't know. It seems to
I
be
was gonna say,
associated with arsenic, but who knows? I mean, if it was a proprietary thing, it might have changed. I don't know.
Got it. And Nancy Odegaard's, I think there's a second edition of that book they're working on now too, if anyone has this, has it. And a compliment, thank you so much for this great presentation, the work you'd already done, and for sharing the pamphlets. Um, uh, Another comment, the AIHA is collecting anonymous exposure sampling data, so it would be great to share. And yes, this is a great point to make too. Kathy Makos and others are organizing a sort of, I don't know if shareable database is the right word, but they're collating information that is taken from different museums, different historical centers. They're making it anonymous and trying to tabulate that all together. So again, people can kind of get a sense of more broadly what's being done and what's being found. So that's another great effort. Another question, how effective are N95 masks at keeping museum workers safe from particulate contaminants like heavy metals, lead, arsenic, etc.? Is that a question we could ask you, Brandy?
absolutely. So N95s under the OSHA's respiratory standard have an assigned protection factor of 10, meaning if they are properly fitted and you have the right size mask and you're wearing it appropriately, about 10% of what would be in the outside air makes it through the mask. For the low levels that we're dealing with traditionally in the collection setting, N95s are usually adequate. So unless you're doing something, that's really generating a dust cloud or something, N95 should cover you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, just in my practice and what I've learned from Brandy and other people, that especially with these heavy metals, it isn't as much of a inhalation or, an airborne issue as it is a dermal issue. So what I've learned and what we've been trying to teach is, training in good glove hygiene. And Maria, as you've been talking about those high touch surfaces, the doorknobs, the keeping your laptops off of work, so all of those types of things. If when you're talking about with the heavy metals and my lab that seems to have lead everywhere all the time, I've learned, I've gotten all this free advice from my colleagues in industrial hygiene, but, just wiping those things down and, trying to keep that contained and just that awareness of all of these incredibly dirty objects that are coming through all the time. And I just feel a lot more confident about not spreading it all over the place. And I never have
Good.
food or drink, not even a water bottle in my studio because I don't want to accidentally grab it while I have, before I've had a chance to wash my hands.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, good hand hygiene and not eating in the spaces where you're handling these objects or drinking is a huge aspect of this.
Yeah, these are really good points because a lot of it is simple changing of our, administrative and engineering, we gotta talk about administrative and engineering controls in the hierarchy of controls, but it's a lot of good can be done just by changing our practices. We tested primary surfaces like work surfaces that objects are on, secondary, so storage. I don't know if tertiary applies, but common touch surfaces, and we're finding things that were testing positive at low levels. A few months later, we're testing negative, and all that had changed. Our collection had not changed. The people working it had not changed. All that had changed is our practice. So it is incredibly powerful, I think, just changing your habits and also starting to understand what is a ingestion risk, what is an inhalation risk, what is an absorption risk, just the modes that these contaminants can enter your body or come in contact with your body. That helps make it more tangible and helps you. Otherwise, you can feel like you're crazy, you're going crazy because you're having to wipe down everything and do all this. But if you can physically or visualize it, it does help. Just to know, hey, these things are decent sized particulate and they can be just abraded off, if you use a solvent, even more so. But that helps too. And I think that's where it comes in. The thing we keep coming back to is how partnerships, how necessary they are. It can be very daunting looking into these questions. And I think that's a lot of reason why this has been looked at these topics for a long time, but it's been hard to get much traction in making people safer. No one has all the answers. And that's kind of the point, is that I cannot be expected to have every answer. I need the help of an industrial hygienist, but even just as much an epidemiologist, a toxicologist, an occupational physician. That in itself can be daunting to think, God, how am I going to find all these people? But there are ways to do it. And certainly through like local health authorities, regional, or in our case, state health authorities, national health authorities, federal ones, there are resources. And really, to make yourself get the right information, make yourself feel better, you do need these multiple perspectives. I think because some people cover the chemistry and some people cover the biology. Let's
Wanted
see.
to add in another practice that I've tried to do with myself over the years, in addition to not having any water things and the touch surfaces, but just not touching my face, trying not to touch my face while I'm doing especially treatment or moving things. I think that that came a little bit out of COVID too. People would talk about with their hands and not, but that's just something else I try to practice that makes me feel better.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. You don't realize how much you touch your eyes and mouth until you try to stop doing it. And yeah, it's just I think compounding simple habit changes that really go a long way. We have another question here. Using a sampling pump and filter for micro vacuum sampling has been used in various cases. One example is the U.S. Department of Energy investigated this for beryllium surface sampling, where wet wipe or dry wipe sampling cannot be used. It also can be useful for fiber surfaces. Is this another possible method which could be used? And Michael, feel free to unmute yourself and elaborate if you'd like. Are you talking about vacuuming the surface of an object and collecting something from the vacuum bag or the midway, or actually examine, like, extracting off headspace around something that's bagged and
Actually, it's, you have a pump, sampling pump, a filter connected to a filter. I'm sorry, to the sampling pump with some sort of inlet hose or whatever you want to call it. And you can actually go along and vacuum a surface. There was an article in Journal of Occupational Environmental Health, I think in 2007 I found, and there's been some other stuff since then, which I think NIOSH was involved in testing, or in figuring out how useful it could be. So I'm trying to think if I ever used it, but that was a long. I know people who did use that, and I just can't remember when I was at Oregon OSHA, and I can't quite remember how well that worked. But apparently, it can be fairly helpful, and especially on textiles and carpets, because you're not damaging anything. You're not um, using wet wipes on things that maybe you shouldn't, um, etc. So just an idea.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I've actually done a little bit of that, like in well, first of all, those like the sponges that we use already for treatment, right? That we're removing, items to send those off for analysis, or like in textile conservation, with almost every treatment proposal, I'm doing a little vacuum test where I put like the clean muslin over the vacuum nozzle, vacuum a section, and then look at what I'm doing.
Okay.
And I've actually done lead test strips on the dust that I pick up during the vacuum test. And that could be something that you could send off for analysis. I think these are all next step possibilities for research, and really good opportunities for, again, having a conservator partnering with an industrial hygienist to utilize those techniques, like exactly that they're using, that we're already using in treatment, and combining those to give more access to analysis and more information that we can get from things that we're doing already. So it's just refining these, like air sampling
Yeah.
that they do in industrial hygiene, and combining that with techniques that we're doing that are safe for objects.
And one
I
thing
have,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, one thing I ran across was just a mention in an article about Department of Energy using this. I think it was Los Alamos or somewhere. That it was a note they had about using it as a method of sampling for anthrax, and I'm not sure how much anthrax can be an issue with um, wool and stuff like that, because it used to be a problem with people handling wool, sheep's wool. So just another nasty idea out there, nasty problem that can exist.
thank you, Michael, for sharing that.
All I was going to say is that I am familiar with micro vacuum sampling. Usually you put a filter in line with the pump and you have a little tube on the end and you vacuum a surface, and you can submit them. We use it a lot for asbestos analysis when we're trying to figure out how far a fiber release episode has gone. I could see how you might be able to use it for this sort of application. It may be a little bit more complicated of a pamphlet, though. Because now we're
I
dealing
imagine
with
that seems like a good study for in a conservation lab, or a fellow study or something like that. But there's definitely application here, and I think working with, again, but being able to work with tools that already exist and adapting those can go a long way, instead of trying to reinvent.
Yeah. And maybe if NIOSH would probably be quite interested in this, assuming that we get all of NIOSH back at some point in the future.
Yes. No, thank you. I mean, thinking of, and I know we're presenting this here in the US, but we want people to, we want to learn about equivalencies in other countries too. But yeah, for us here in the US, NIOSH and the ERCs are, very good partners, and the ERCs are funded by NIOSH, if I'm remembering right, and Keith, correct me if I'm wrong. OSHA actually also has, free consultation services. So yeah, getting support from these higher levels, it's something to keep in mind, for sure. We have another compliment from another attendee. Thank you for such a very informative presentation. One question: how do you clean surfaces after handling objects? And I think this might be a question for you, Mark.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of what this whole paper, like the craft paper, is all about, is that we're trying to avoid having to create the cross contamination in general. I mean, we do general cleaning of like soap and water on surfaces that we can. But also I feel like Paulette and Brandy might have some input as well from their experience or recommendation.
Yeah, so any general surface cleaner on those applied surfaces that's appropriate for your space will go a long way in collecting those particles.
I mean, I think, Maria, what you described, I just have my alcohol water mixture in the spray bottle and I use paper towels and wipe it and throw it away.
Yeah.
With taking the gloves and the correct way on and off.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Is good glove hygiene too, is there's concepts of donning and doffing your PPE as another layer of it that we learned from our partners in the OEHS community. A proper way to take off gloves, which they also use these methods in hospitals, where the contamination is much more visual. And, but there are specific ways to remove your gloves in particular as well, and lab coats. Yeah, we found that water and alcohol mixture to be pretty effective, and testing corroborated it. Mary Corrigan shares some information about submitting data for the AIHA exposure assessment database as well. So please check your chat there. And Mary's also shared information on cyberizing as well as a link. An arsenical moth-proofing treatment applied to textiles. Another participant shares, a link potentially to the article mentioned, evaluation of standardized micro vacuum sampling method for collection of surface dust. Thank you so much. Another question: are the industrial hygienists able to identify organic pesticides on the wipe samples?
So, short answer is mostly. I would recommend calling your lab because, as I mentioned before, ghost wipes probably aren't suitable for organics. You'll need a different solvent. I know certain ones are better in hexane versus alcohol, and depending on which organic that you are targeting, your lab will know exactly what solvent is the best one to put on like a clean cotton pad to do the wipes. So, and usually they'll provide the supplies for you to do that. So they'll send you the solvent in a little bottle and the clean pads.
Thank you.
And that's where I wonder if, I don't know, again, I'd like to see a study, but I wonder if it makes more sense to do more of the bulk sample instead of a wipe sample. But you could use, if you were doing like a vacuum test with the muslin, and then you could have the control with the muslin and then the one with the dust, sponge, and then they can use whatever sample they want to destroy, what you're sending in.
Yeah.
I feel like there might be some application there.
Yeah, and you probably want to coordinate with the lab too, Paulette, because certain materials dissolve better than others. So they may have some advice that they would give you on what to use as that filter on the end of your vacuum test.
Yeah, exactly. Like this is it's a study. It's something that, I don't know, if there's any students on here.
Research ideas, yeah.
Yeah. And Brandy, thanks for corroborating. Yeah, the OSHA onsite program is we were blown away when we found out about it. Don't more people know about this? It's a free resource that exists in the US in every state and every territory. And they provide free and non-infraction giving consultation. So you're not exposing yourself, you're not getting yourself in trouble. And they provide really fulsome response and coverage. They'll come on site and review for all kinds of hazards, not just chemical, but physical, and they'll test for you for free. And they'll guide you through interpretation of the data. Because yeah, I mean, interpretation is a whole nother thing. I have a degree in chemistry and I still can't read these things half the time. So it's yeah, it's a fabulous resource, and more people qualify than you might think. So for those of us listening or from the US, don't be shy in reaching out to them. And if you need some guidance in that, asking Brandy or asking myself, glad to give some guidance. But they're a powerful resource, and they're there to help, and they're eager to help. On effort to restore NIOSH, your stories are important. Mary provides a link to share your thoughts. And another compliment, thank you, very informative. We are almost at 2:30, so we filled up our time completely. I have a bunch of questions too, but I think we've taken enough of your time, and I just want to applaud you guys on many, many levels. This is some powerful work on just breaking down barriers and making things more accessible. And then, Mark, in your case, helping people along in a changed mindset. That's not easy. You've really made some great cultural shifts there, and it sounds like you've got a great team there as well. So thank you guys for sharing all this information, and thank you for joining us.